Greetings. Welcome back to HET II, Hillsdale College. We're continuing with our story of the School of Lausanne. And so here we are, HET II, Hillsdale College, and we're going to move on to Vilfredo Pareto. Now recall we have finished up with Leon Walras, and Walras was, ended up at the University of Lausanne. He stepped down from his position in 1892. He was replaced by Vilfredo Pareto. So Pareto lived, it was an Italian, he lived 1848 until what? 1923. And really interesting character. You'll notice that I've given you already a reading, My Dinner with Pareto, and I think that gives a good description of what he was like as a man. He was a pretty unusual character. Let's get this out of the way. Move our Hillsdale Charger H. And so, difficult man. People tended to be a little bit scared of him. He was skilled with a sword and a pistol, and it was said that he was quite prepared to use them. Israel Kirzner describes him as, says that he was feared by other economists as an angry, high-tech economist, a mathematician's mathematician. He was also famous for being a sociologist, early sociologist, and he ended up with a theory that groups oppress groups. He developed something about this. Towards the end of his life, he attracted the attention of Mussolini, who was favorably impressed by him, and Mussolini made him a member of the Italian Senate during the beginning of the fascist reign. And so Pareto took that position and proceeded to publicly denounce the fascists for suppressing freedom of speech. And then he died before anybody could do anything about it, passed away. One of his biographers, a man by the name of Tarasio, who is probably retired by now, at University of North Carolina, Tarasio describes Pareto as seeing himself as an economist, as fighting. He fought 4 battles. That's important for our story and for his contributions. His first battle was against the German historical school, in which he is defending theory against their attacks. He's in favor of pure theory. So there's a story, which turns out to be true, that Pareto was at a conference and Gustav Schmoller, head of the younger German historical school, was out speaking, and Schmoller says, there is no such thing as a law of economics, true at all times and places. That's just not true. There are no economic laws. Pareto is fuming. He's angry. And so at some point, later after the conference closes for the night, Schmoller is walking down the street and he's approached by this beggar, disheveled mess. And the beggar comes up to him and says, "Sir, can you tell me," he says, "I'm hungry. Where is there a restaurant where I could eat, where I have no money? Where is a restaurant where they don't charge for the food?" And Schmoller says, "There is no such thing." Off comes the disguise, and Pareto shouts, "So you scoundrel, you admit there are economic laws." So, remember that. We're facing a lot of scoundrels who don't believe in economic laws. Remember that as a method. Hang them by their own words. Let them say things and then trap them in them. So, that's Pareto. Well, that's his first battle was against the German historical school. He was a participant in the Methodenstreit. But another of his battles was against the literary economists. You might think of the Austrians here, but he was defending mathematics, the use of math in economics. Another of his battles that he saw was against the Marshallians. The Marshallians he also thought were literary, but attacking them, defending general equilibrium against their partial equilibrium approach. We've seen that with Walras. His fourth battle is the one we're interested in. He was fighting it against what he said was those who have a hankering for metaphysics. Economics has to be about observables, not about metaphysics, this woo stuff. Well, what's metaphysical in economics? Utility? Cardinal utility. What is a util? There is no such thing. Now recall the history of utility theory. We have Jeremy Bentham. Bentham argued that utility is cardinal and interpersonally comparable. We could get a utility number for an action or an event for every person and add them up and get the utility of society. That's Bentham. Marshall says, well, maybe we can't do that, but we could measure utility using consumer surplus. We will use the measuring rod of money. And then Edgeworth comes along and says, well, actually, Marshall, that's not quite right, because that would only work if we had a constant marginal utility of money and everybody had the very same utility function. Then you could add them up. But that doesn't hold. Now, the early Austrians are somewhat unclear about this. Menger is very much into the ordinal utility idea, but Wieser confuses marginal utility with price. Menger doesn't like that idea, but he's not clear enough about it. And Walras says that the Austrians are just all wrong on utility because they seem to think that it's same thing as price or money or something. And Pareto says all of this stuff is wrong. Not Menger, as it turns out, but all of this stuff is wrong. He decisively, ruthlessly rejects those things. He says we don't need cardinality. We don't need additivity for utility. We don't need a concept of total utility. That stuff is meaningless. We don't even need a consumer, he says. All that we need are the consumer's preferences, in fact, just preference maps, indifference curves that Edgeworth has given us. Now, maybe that's going a little bit too far, but at least for some purposes, all we need are the preferences. And those are ordinal. And very quickly, Ludwig von Mises and Irving Fisher in the United States agree that utility must be ordinal. And that becomes then the dominant, the sensible approach. Well, Pareto takes Edgeworth's indifference curve approach, brings it into Walrasian general equilibrium, gives it an ordinal interpretation, and then proceeds to develop some results. But what do we mean, first of all, by cardinal versus ordinal utility? This is important, and students in HET, I try to explain this, and frequently they get it all wrong, even after I've explained it. So listen carefully. Cardinal utility versus ordinal utility is one thing. Interpersonal comparisons of utility versus not being interpersonally comparison is a different thing. They're not the same concepts. So let's first talk just about cardinal utility. Cardinal utility would be, and we'll also compare that to ordinal utility. Cardinal utility would be the idea, suppose we have good A, B, and C. I don't know, apples, bananas, apple, banana, and a cantaloupe. And maybe this, if we believe in cardinal utility, this one gives 6 utils, this one gives 4 utils, and this one gives 3 utils to the consumer, so we see their preference, how they ordered those. Ordinal would simply mean A is the first best, B is the second best, and C is the third best. That's just a ranking in order, okay? So with this one, those are utils, whatever a util might be, some metaphysical thing that someone just made up. Well, we could look at something like this. We could add them up. If they had all that stuff, they'd have a total utility of 13. Oh, great. And we could say that that one is, an A is twice as good as a C for this person. But here, you can't do anything like that. You can't add these up and get 6th. Well, that doesn't make any sense. What would it mean? That one's not 1/3 the benefit of that. These are just rankings. You can't say anything about there's nothing additive here. It's just a ranking. All you can say is that A is better than C. There's no quantitative measure. But here, there's a quantitative measure. But that quantitative measure is the thing that Pareto points out doesn't exist, and nothing in our theory justifies us to pretend that it does. Well, what are the implications of this for exchange? Well, first of all, one implication is that total utility is meaningless. That's a nonsensical argument. A second one is that interpersonal comparisons of utility are meaningless. Okay? These are just rankings. Now, it could be that you had cardinal utility and interpersonal comparisons of utility would still be meaningless. Because even if there was such a thing as a util, you might say, yeah, well, Steele's utils can't be compared meaningfully to Wolfram's utils or Pongrassic's utils or your utils. I value my utils very highly, and you value yours more highly than mine. We differ on that. So cardinal utility doesn't imply interpersonal comparison of utility, but that one seems to imply that it's impossible. And with that one, we're not sure. So interpersonal comparison and whether it's cardinal or ordinal, different issues. Great, that's where students get lost. You won't. You're smarter. You're better than that. So at any rate, the third point we want to make is that explaining exchange does not require interpersonal comparisons of utility. Really, to do economics, we don't need interpersonal comparisons of utility at all. It's not important. Here's the demonstration of that. Suppose we have person A has an endowment of an X and person B has an endowment of a Y. So Adam Smith has a xylophone and Bombavark has a yak. And so they trade. So what can we say about that? If A gives the X to B and B gives the Y to A, they've traded, we can then say, well, let's see, can we say the following? A valued the Y more than B did, and B valued the X more than Y did. Can we say that? And the answer is no. That's an interpersonal comparison of utility. We don't say that. We don't need to say it. What we can conclude from what we've observed is that A valued the Y more than the X, and B, Bombavark, valued the X more than the Y. We've done intrapersonal, within the person comparisons. That's all we need. We don't care about any differences between them as far as like how much, because we can't say that. All we need is this right here. What else do we notice about this? Well, we notice that after the trade, A is better off than he was before the trade, and B is better off than he was before the trade. So there are mutual gains. Each one is better off in his own opinion. So as observers, as economists observing this, we can say everyone is better off. He's better off, just ask him. He's better off, just ask him. So I guess the society consisting of those two people is better off. We can say that without making, there's a social gain, without saying anything about interpersonal comparisons of utility, without saying social utility, or really without a value judgment if we're willing just to take their word for it. Okay? We don't need our own value judgment to say that that situation was one of mutual improvement. Okay? That was a voluntary trade. Now suppose instead we do something different. A different scenario. They start out with their endowments, and then A simply takes the Y from B. Just grabs it. Now what can we say? Well, we can say A is better off, B is worse off, and social effect? There's no net social effect. We've said everything we can say. He's better off, he's worse off, nothing more can be said. As a society as a whole, there's nothing to say. We could only say something about whether things are better off if we invoke an ethical standard, a value judgment, a normative principle. So we might say, oh my gosh, A stole it. That's bad. Society's worse off or something. We might say, well, B had stolen that originally and A got it back, so things are better off. Or we might say, it's a fairer distribution of property, or we're egalitarian, so they should be, with different kinds of things we can add. but we need an ethical standard to analyze that as to whether the situation is now better off or worse off. So this is the basis then of what we call Pareto optimality. These are valuable insights, shows the limits of positive analysis, and it emphasizes the need that if we're going to do any kind of normative judgments or welfare economics, we need to specify our ethical standards. This is what Pareto says, and Pareto is right. Great. So let's pick up a little bit of formal analysis here, and we're going to develop a tool. Let's clear the board and remove that. We already know what his lifespan was. Great. And so let's proceed. We're going to develop something that Pareto invents called the Edgeworth Box. This is economics, so we're always a little bit strange in our terminology. But this, many of you have seen an Edgeworth Box if you've taken a course, say, with Dr. Wolfram. Maybe we use it in some other courses as well, but Dr. Wolfram's upper division courses often use this. It's a very useful tool for certain purposes. We're going to go ahead and develop the idea of it. Some of you know this pretty well, and for some of you, it might be something new. But it's a trading economy. We're just going to keep it very simple and not have production, just as we did when we were earlier working with Walras and Walras' law. We're going to have persons A and B, goods X and Y. We'll start with an endowment. So we have person A, we have person B, and the goods are X and Y. The total endowment in the society, the total amount in this economy, will have 10 units of X and 5 units of Y. Is there? That's how we make a Y, I think. That's how they taught me in grade school. I've forgotten that already. All right, great. Well, each one of these persons has preferences over these goods. So, for example, we can draw those as indifference curves that we've already studied that come from Edgeworth. So for person A, this might be their set of indifference curves. And of course, there are only 10 units, so we go anywhere from 0 to 10. And there, that would go from 0 to 5, the total amount in the economy. And of course, there are infinitely many of these curves because there are infinitely many different baskets that we could have in there. So we've got that. And then for person B, we shall draw that over here, and we've got X and Y, and again, that's 5 and 10, and so this is the preference map for person B. Also nice, we've drawn a few indifference curves, and there they lie. And of course, at this point, that would be a point at which, that point right there, A owns nothing. That would mean that everything was held by B, and B must be up at a place like 5 and 10 there. But of course, if B has nothing, that would be a place where A has everything. So I can take, the notion is, whatever A doesn't have, B has. I can take this indifference map, bring it over here, rotating it, flipping it around this way, and converting this into a box. That's what I'm going to do. It's going to go, that's the sound of it rotating. And we end up with an Edgeworth box. Oh my goodness. It's supposed to be a straight line. This is economics. Assume it's a straight line. And B's preference map and indifference curves are running this way. 0 for B, 0 for A, etc. Great. So clear? There's the Edgeworth box. We're now ready to rock and roll, says Pareto, or to analyze this. What's the initial endowment for each player or each person in this little economy? Well, let's go ahead and clean this up a bit. And we will just say that, suppose we just started out, and we'll just call that alpha. We'll just give it a name. Alpha, if you prefer, call it anything you like. A, B, Bob, whatever, doesn't matter. But Greek letters are always nice for making it look really mathematical. And it must be that there are indifference curves that run through that space, because there are indifference curves all through here. They can always rank any point, any basket in there. That's the whole indifference curve approach. And so we have this. What does that represent? That means that X alpha is what A starts with, and Y alpha is what A starts with. Okay? That's A's initial endowment. Person B then is starting with 10 minus X alpha and 5 minus Y alpha. That's his initial endowment for B. And so that's what B has right there, and that's what B has right there. And so that should all work out. That should be Y and, never mind. I put a little, anyway, that should be clear, right? Right. It's clear to me. So let's start out then and talk about voluntary trading. What could happen with this? We're going to restrict ourselves to voluntary trades. That's crucial. Well, if we go this, there's the indifference curve that A has at that starting point. If we move that way, obviously A is getting to a higher level of utility, higher indifference curve, is getting better off. If we go this way, B is getting better off. So if they're going to trade, and it's going to be voluntary, they will only trade if the trading makes them at least as well off, or really probably what's better off, which means that the first rule of trading is that the voluntary trading, and my marker is already falling apart, so missed. Get that one. Voluntary trading, look at that, beautiful. Voluntary trading, number one, no one worse off. That's the first rule that we'll follow. What does that mean? It means, otherwise they wouldn't trade. So it means we're within the lens, or at least that includes the boundaries. That is to say, any trade can only be within there. People won't trade to that. That makes A worse off. They won't trade over there. That makes B worse off. You can always reject the trade. Second principle is, if after trading, there's still a lens, as it's called, more trade possible. Okay, great. And more gains are possible. So any point inside of this thing is an improvement. Let's say they traded to that point right there. That is to say, A gave up that much X, but gave up that much X, but received that much Y in return. A is better off, B is better off, they could trade to there. But now think of what the indifference curves probably look like. We'll draw a couple in. And they might be something like this. Well, there's still a lens here. There's still potential for gains from trade. And so what they've done here is they've made what is called a Pareto improvement. They're both better off. They continue to trade so long as there's a lens, and eventually they get to a point like this one. I hope you can see that. I'll blow it up over here, but that's a point of tangency. No longer is there a lens after that. So you'd see a point like this. There's the indifference curve for A, the indifference curve for B, and they've traded to that point right there, and there's no further trade possible that will make both better off. So Great, we can draw that. And the thing is, you'll notice that there might be many of those points within there where that happens. And that will take the set of those points, that one and that one and that one, and all the others. The boundaries are included. So you have what is called, we'll draw that. That is called the contract curve. The set of all those tangencies or places to which they could trade, and then there's no more possible gains from trade. That's the contract curve, that green thing. I drew it with kind of some squiggle or bend to it. There's no set pattern that it has to follow. It depends on what the preferences are. That's why I didn't draw it as a straight line. Great. Well, that's interesting because, first of all, he's shown that this confirms Edgeworth's conjecture or argument that if you have a market with just two traders, there are multiple market clearing prices, there are multiple equilibria. Menger had said the same thing, so it confirms Menger. Great. So let's clean this up so we can look at this further and analyze it just a bit. Get all that out of there. Extraneous at this point. And great, there's our lens. And what do I want to put in there? A contract curve. Don't do that. There's our contract curve, points of tangencies. And we'll start thinking about two different points in there. There's a point, and there's a point, and we'll think about those things. And so we'll call that one, well, let's give it another Greek name. We'll call that one beta, and we'll call that one gamma. We started out, of course, at alpha. So everyone in this economy, A and B, agrees that beta is better than alpha. Everyone agrees that gamma is better than alpha. They, of course, disagree over which is better, beta or gamma. But an economist can look at this and say, the fact that they've traded and gotten to one of those points means it is better in the sense that everybody agrees and that society of two people is better. And of course, we can use this in as many dimensions as we wish, but we can't graph it. As many dimensions means with as many actors or players or individuals. Great. Well, which one of those things is better, beta or gamma? A and B disagree, and since we're not going to make interpersonal comparisons of utility, the theory won't allow us to do that. The external observer, the economist, cannot say one is better than another without imposing an additional standard, some sort of normative criterion, some sort of an ethical or value judgment. Those are both what we call Pareto optima. And a Pareto optimum, then, is a point where the Pareto optimum technically is a state, situation, or allocation in which no one can be made better off without making at least one person worse off. That is to say, a state, allocation, situation, event, now we'll call it a situation, it's really a resting spot, in which no one can be made better off without making at least one worse off. You can't reallocate things without hurting somebody. Okay? A Pareto improvement would be, of course, a change in circumstances that make at least one person better off and no one worse off, so that nobody would object to that kind of a change. Here, another way of stating this then is that the Pareto optimum, not a post office or some other thing. The Pareto optimum is an allocation at which no Pareto improvement is possible. You know, in one of the little introductory videos that I had done, I said something about the theory of entrepreneurship tells us that there must be, if things are, if we're in a crisis period, if there are things going wrong, there must be opportunities to fix them. That is, to make gain, at least, maybe not fix them, but to make gain, to make things better. And then I said something strange like, if not, we live in the best of all possible worlds. That's the idea here. Are you trying to tell me that if no Pareto improvement is possible, you must be in a Pareto optimal position? No one can be made better off without making someone worse off. Great. That was what I was getting at, in part. So at any rate, great. Well, this becomes the foundation of welfare economics. What's welfare economics? That's the study of how events or policies or other kinds of things make people in general better off or worse off. Can we say anything about whether a policy or an event or a situation makes things better off? It avoids us having to try to do things like aggregate utility or invent social utility and those sorts of weird things. Welfare economics, the economic analysis of outcomes and policies and outcomes and the effects on the well-being of the people in the economy. Now notice something here, and that is that this is, I think, quite important. In principle, there is a set of, the whole contract curve runs like this. And of course, we specified that as our starting point. That was our alpha, where we started out. That's a distribution, initial distribution of property rights. And that told us what part of the contract curve we could get to, and then we could begin to analyze it, whether or not things get better or not. We could look alpha, beta, gamma, what delta, I don't know. Look, the different allocation we could have started at would be delta. Suppose we started there. Well, we'd have a different set of points that a different set of Pareto optima that would be relevant. If the property rights, initial property rights change, then the interactions, and we limit ourselves to voluntary changes, we change the set of Pareto optima within the lens. Now, that might seem kind of weird, like, why are you bringing this up? I think that frequently economists have failed to recognize that. Let me first of all point something out here. Let's do a little bit of analysis. You know what egalitarianism is? The egalitarian argues that we should have the fair, good, optimal thing is to have equal distribution. Well, where is that? Where's the egalitarian distribution? Would be half and half. Well, it's not even in the Pareto. It's not even a Pareto optimum. If we'd started from somewhere else, a different thing, well, it's not a Pareto optimum. Let's put it this way. Both the parties agree you can do better than that. That's all I wanted to say. Okay? Great. Now, if property rights are specified and we're limited to what we can do, that's the basis of the argument. We're limited to voluntary trading. That's the basis of the argument that market trading systematically makes people better off. People can reject deals that don't make them better off. We have the voluntary nature of trading. Now, of course, people do make mistakes, but the market shuts down the mistakes with price signals of profit and loss, of gain and loss. Non-market activity does not have those signals of profit and loss. The government can force people to make involuntary exchanges. It can force people to do things that otherwise they wouldn't want to do. Non-market activity could consistently make people worse off without facing any kind of a shutdown mechanism, like profit and loss. So this is key. The voluntary nature of market exchange. It also underlies Pareto's welfare insight. Now, I'll simply say that some people have confused that. They think, well, the government can intervene and just systematically make things better. You have to have a theory if you're going to explain why that is. I'm pretty skeptical. But some people will also talk about, we have the market process outside of the market. A market process that operates outside of the market, that is outside of the constraints of private property and voluntary trade. Now, either that argument makes no sense or it's relying on a very different mechanism. What am I talking about? Someone says, well, you don't even need the market. It's optimal to, pirates can organize. It shows the invisible hand somehow, this meta theory. That's not restricting ourselves to private property rights and voluntary trading. Now, here's the ruthlessness of Pareto. He steadfastly refuses to make interpersonal comparisons of utility. Everybody wants to. Everybody wants to be able to look at a position like that and argue about which one's better. Here's an example. Doesn't utility theory show that we should tax the rich people to help the poor people? Because the poor, with almost no money, must have higher marginal utility for every additional dollar than a rich person with lots of, and the answer is no. You can't say anything. There's nothing in utility theory that makes us do these, allows us to do a scientific, objective comparison of utility interpersonally. In other words, you can take $1,000 from Bill Gates and give it to a poor, struggling widow with children, and yet nothing in economics tells us that makes the world better off. That's got to be an ethical thing. Let's get extreme. You can assassinate Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Osama bin Laden, and save thousands or millions of lives. Can you say that, can utility theory, can economics tell us that makes the world better off? And the answer is no. You sacrifice, they're worse off and everybody else is better off. But economics can't tell you about that. Those are ethical standards, and we can employ those to explain which we think is best. But positive economics can't do it. That's what Pareto says, and Pareto is exactly right about it. The Austrians, and especially Mises, for example, quickly adopt this position as well. Here's another implication that follows from that. Positive economics cannot say the free market is better than socialism. Nor can it say socialism is better than the free market. You have to specify the goals, and then economics can tell you which one is better. That kind of result drives economists crazy. And so they come up with many stratagems to try to get around it. So for example, there's the Kaldor-Hicks criterion, which asks, okay, we can't make interpersonal comparisons of utility, but could the winners, could those who gain in some situation afford to compensate the losers and still be winners? So that is, do they gain enough to be able to pay off the losers? Or people will try to invent social welfare functions, all very creative things, but they end up making interpersonal comparisons of utility in some sense. Your textbook, this is the worst line in the textbook, says, it is perhaps too early to decide whether the quest for a value-free social welfare function is illusory or not. And the answer to that is no. Kenneth Arrow in 1950 and 1951 formally proved it is impossible. It's called Arrow's impossibility theorem, although he called it the possibility theorem. So there you go. Economics, the only science where the possibility theorem and the impossibility theorem are the same thing. But policy, the point is of all this, is that policy necessarily, absolutely requires, for it to be any good, first we have to know the positive economics, the laws of cause and effect. Then we have to have normative criteria, ethical standards. Those are different. They're both absolutely necessary, and both should be explicitly stated. That's what Pareto has just taught us. Mises agrees, and Mises, when it comes to socialism, says, given the professed goals of most socialists, the free market is better because socialism won't do what even the socialists want. Great. Well, we're going to continue next time, and we're going to discuss something about, we're going to return to a little bit maybe about Jevons, but in particular, we're going to go across the Atlantic, and we're going to end up in the United States and talk about John Bates Clark and the theory of distribution. Until then, keep studying HET.